They told us history was a clean line of facts carved in stone, a story settled and agreed upon. But what if much of what you were taught was not truth at all, but a carefully shaped narrative, smoothed over by victors, repeated by textbooks, and accepted because questioning it felt uncomfortable, because believing it felt easier, because lies repeated long enough begin to feel like memory? And so tonight we pull on the loose threads of the past, not to destroy history, but to hear it speak honestly for the first time, to walk through moments you thought you understood and watch them change shape under the light of evidence. Because history is not just what happened, it is what survived, what was recorded, and what those in power wanted remembered. And one of the greatest lies ever told is that history is neutral, that it simply is, when in reality it has always been edited, censored, dramatized, and weaponized. And to understand the present, we must first unlearn the comforting myths of the past, beginning with the idea that ancient civilizations were primitive and slow, stumbling blindly toward progress, when in fact many were astonishingly advanced, possessing engineering, medical knowledge, and systems of governance that rivaled or surpassed later societies, yet were dismissed for centuries because they did not fit the story of linear Western progress, a story that required Greece and Rome to be the intellectual parents of the modern world while quietly ignoring Mesopotamia, India, China, Africa, and the Americas, where mathematics, astronomy, surgery, urban planning, and democratic principles flourished long before Europe claimed them as discoveries. And nowhere is this clearer than in the myth that democracy was born fully formed in ancient Athens, taught as the cradle of freedom, when in reality Athenian democracy excluded women, slaves, foreigners, and the poor, functioning less as a universal system of representation and more as an experiment limited to a privileged minority, while other societies practiced consultative councils, elected leadership, and communal decision-making that were later erased because they did not align with the narrative of Western exceptionalism. A narrative further reinforced by the idea that the Middle Ages were a dark age of ignorance, a thousand-year pause between classical brilliance and modern enlightenment, a phrase itself invented centuries later to elevate the Renaissance by diminishing everything that came before it, when in truth, the medieval world saw universities established, complex legal systems developed, agricultural revolutions transformed food production, and scientific inquiry preserved and expanded through Islamic scholars who translated, critiqued, and advanced ancient knowledge, while Europe burned books and feared curiosity. Yet textbooks long framed the Islamic Golden Age as a footnote rather than a foundation, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that modern science stands on pillars built outside Europe. And perhaps no lie is more deeply embedded than the belief that great explorers discovered lands that were already inhabited by millions, complex societies labeled as empty or uncivilized simply because they did not resemble Europe, a convenient fiction that allowed conquest to masquerade as destiny, genocide to be renamed settlement, and theft to be justified as progress, turning Christopher Columbus into a heroic pioneer rather than the initiator of one of history's most devastating chains of violence, slavery, and disease. A man celebrated for bravery while his own writings documented brutality so extreme that even his contemporaries were disturbed. Yet classrooms softened his legacy into sanitized adventure, because nations prefer founding myths that inspire pride rather than provoke shame. And this pattern repeats again and again in the lie that the American Revolution was a unified struggle for freedom, when it was deeply divided, driven as much by economic interests and elite fears of losing power as by lofty ideals, with many colonists remaining loyal to the crown, enslaved people excluded from liberty, and native nations caught between forces that would erase them regardless of outcome. Yet the simplified story of patriots versus tyrants proved easier to tell than the truth of conflicting motives and unfinished promises. Promises further betrayed by the myth that slavery ended because moral awakening triumphed, when in reality, economic shifts, industrialization, rebellion by the enslaved, and political calculation played decisive roles, with abolition often arriving not as a gift from the powerful, but as a concession wrested through resistance, blood, and fear. a truth that unsettles the comforting narrative of gradual human progress guided by enlightened leaders. Just as unsettling is the lie that wars are fought primarily for ideals, for freedom, faith, or defense, when history shows again and again that wars are more often driven by resources, trade routes, debt, and the ambitions of a few, wrapped in moral language to secure public support. From the Crusades, portrayed as holy missions while functioning as territorial expansion, to modern conflicts framed as liberation while securing oil, influence, or strategic dominance. And nowhere is this more evident than in the story of World War I, long taught as an inevitable explosion of alliances and nationalism, when in fact it was a result of calculated decisions, secret treaties, imperial arrogance, and leaders who believed war would be short and glorious, sending millions to die for borders that would be redrawn again within a generation. A catastrophe then followed by another lie, that the Treaty of Versailles brought peace, when it instead sowed humiliation, economic collapse, and resentment that made another war almost certain. And even within World War II, often presented as a clear battle of good versus evil, history becomes more complicated upon closer inspection, revealing moral compromises, civilian bombings, internment camps, propaganda, and strategic alliances with brutal regimes. Truths often downplayed to preserve the narrative of righteous victory, because admitting complexity threatens the idea that history has heroes without shadows, a need for simplicity that also fuels the myth of the lone genius, the belief that progress is driven by singular, brilliant individuals, rather than collective effort, circumstance, and forgotten contributors, allowing figures like Edison to eclipse the work of Nikola Tesla, Rosalind Franklin to be erased from the discovery of DNA, and countless inventors, scholars, and laborers to vanish from memory because their stories were inconvenient, unmarketable, or politically uncomfortable. And perhaps the most dangerous lie of all is the idea that history is settled, that we already know what happened, because this belief discourages questioning, silences marginalized voices, and allows those in power to keep shaping the past to justify the present, rewriting textbooks, banning discussions, and labeling uncomfortable truths as revisionism, when in reality, revision is the heartbeat of historical understanding, the process by which new evidence, perspectives, and voices reshape what we thought we knew, not to destroy history, but to rescue it from propaganda. And this struggle over the past continues today in debates over monuments, national heroes, and collective memory, where stone statues and holidays become battlegrounds for identity, because memory itself is power, and controlling history means controlling who is seen as legitimate, who is seen as dangerous, and whose suffering counts. Which is why empires invested so heavily in archives, censuses, and official narratives, why colonial powers rewrote indigenous histories, why authoritarian regimes still manipulate records, and why even democratic societies struggle to tell honest stories about their origins. Because truth is disruptive, it complicates pride, it demands accountability, and it reminds us that progress is neither guaranteed nor evenly shared. And as we pull back the curtain on these lies, what emerges is not a cynical rejection of history, but a deeper respect for it, a recognition that the past is alive, contested, and human, shaped by fear, hope, greed, courage, and survival, and that by understanding how we were taught wrong, we gain the ability to see the present more clearly, to question narratives that demand blind loyalty, to recognize when history is being used as a weapon rather than a lesson. Because the greatest danger is not that history contains lies, but that we stop questioning them. And so the real story of history is not one of perfect heroes and inevitable progress, but of voices struggling to be heard, truths buried and rediscovered, and a reminder that what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget will shape the world that comes next.